The sun hung low over the dusty horizon, casting long shadows across the endless plains of the west. The wind carried a dry, hollow whistle through the skeletal remains of abandoned homesteads, and somewhere in the distance, a lone hawk circled above. Eli Carver, a man weathered by the years and hardened by disappointment, rode slowly along a narrow dirt trail leading to a property that cost less than a single horse. $1. That's all it took for him to claim the land that no one else wanted. Most folks in town had called him foolish, muttering about the cursed nature of cheap property and the ghosts that lingered where no one dared to settle. Eli hadn't cared. He wasn't after wealth nor fame. He was after a chance of slim, stubborn hope to build something that could stand taller than the emptiness in his own life. Eli had spent most of his life wrestling with a bitterness that never left him. Years of longing, of empty arms, and quiet nights spent listening to the wind outside his small cabin. The doctor's words had been clear and merciless. He could not have children. For a man like Eli, whose family had owned small parcels of land for generations, that news was a blow deeper than any bullet wound. A ranch without heirs felt hollow, a life without a legacy. And yet here he was, eyes squinting against the dying light, staring at a fence that was more rust than wood, and a barn that sagged like it carried decades of sorrow in its beams. The town nearest the ranch had long ago shrunk to a scattering of shuttered shops and a saloon that smelled of old whiskey and smoke. Only a few stubborn families remained, people who either refused to leave or had nowhere else to go. Rumors whispered about the land Eli had purchased. Some said the previous owner had vanished without a trace. Others swore the property was cursed, that those who tried to tame it ended up worse off than before. But Eli Carver didn't care for stories. He had faced worse ghosts, already ghosts of a life unlived, of hopes deferred, of nights alone in the quiet agony of knowing he would never hear the sound of a child's laughter. He dismounted at the barn, his boots sinking into the dry soil. The wood creaked under his weight, and the air smelled of old hay and earth. His fingers brushed the cold, splintered beams as he walked toward the stable, the shadows growing longer as night approached. There was a stillness here, a silence that felt almost alive, as though the land itself was waiting for something, or someone. Eli paused, listening. A faint sound carried through the darkness, a soft, uneven breathing, like someone trying to stay hidden. Eli's heart thudded. He wasn't expecting company. No one had lived here for months. The thought of squatters had crossed his mind, but his gut told him this was different. With cautious steps, he pushed open the creaking door of the stable. There, tucked in the corner between a stack of hay bales and the wooden feed trough, was a girl. Her hair was tangled and dusty, her eyes wide with fear, and her hands clutched her stomach protectively. The moonlight spilling through the gaps in the barn illuminated the truth in a glance she was expecting. Shock struck Eli like a thunderbolt. He had not imagined this, not in 1,000 years. The land, the solitude, the promise of a quiet life, none of it, had prepared him for the presence of a living, breathing soul in need of help. The girl looked up at him, her gaze wary, searching for judgment or anger, and found instead something she did not expect, a quiet steadiness, a patience that seemed almost unnatural for a man so alone. Eli's voice caught in his throat as he asked the first question he didn't know how to form. "Who are you?" Her answer came in a whisper, tremulous but defiant. "I had nowhere else to go." There was a weight in her tone, a history untold, and Eli felt the old ache in his chest twist into something he hadn't recognized in years. Responsibility. Not just for the land, not just for a dream, but for a life fragile, unclaimed, and full of questions that demanded answers. Eli helped her to her feet, his hands firm yet careful, mindful of the life she carried within her. He looked around the barn once more. The place was a ruin, but under his careful gaze, possibilities began to take shape. Cracked beams could be mended, empty stalls filled, fences rebuilt. Maybe, just maybe, this place could become more than a dollar investment. Maybe it could become a home. The night deepened, stars prickling the velvet sky. And still, Eli and the girl stood there in the dim light, two strangers drawn together by circumstance in quiet desperation. Each had scars the other could not see. He, a lifetime of longing and loss. She, the burden of uncertainty and fear. And yet in that moment, a fragile connection formed, something raw and unspoken. Both knew that what lay ahead would not be simple. The townsfolk would whisper, old suspicions would surface, and the path to safety and trust would be treacherous. But for now, all that mattered was that they were not alone. Eli led her toward the back of the stable, where a small loft offered a space that could be made livable. He glanced down at her again, noting the pallor in her cheeks and the way she flinched at every sudden sound. Questions buzzed in his mind, relentless and urgent. How had she come to this place? Who was she running from? Most pressing of all, why here of all places? Had she sought refuge in a crumbling barn that had been abandoned for months? The wind shifted outside, carrying with it the faint creak of a gate, swinging in the night. The sound made Eli tense. He couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter had been no accident. The land itself seemed to pulse with secrets, with histories written in dust and whispered in the rustling grass. And in the quiet, Eli understood something profound. Life often arrived where it was least expected. And sometimes the smallest, most forsaken places could hold the greatest surprises. He set about preparing the loft with what little supplies he had scavenged from the property. Blankets, a wooden crate for a makeshift bed, a few cans of food enough to see them through the first night. The girl watched silently, her eyes alert but wary. There was a tension in the air, a sense that everything could shift in a heartbeat. And Eli felt the weight of the unspoken truth pressing down on them both. Neither spoke of the future, yet both sensed that it had arrived in the shape of the other. As the moon rose higher, casting silver light over the ranch, Eli stood outside the stable and looked over his new property. The dollar he had spent seemed almost absurd now, given the magnitude of the events that had unfolded. He had come seeking land, perhaps a purpose, but what he had found was something far more profound. The fragile spark of life. The promise of connection, and a challenge unlike any he had ever faced. In the darkness, the wind whispered through the broken fence posts, carrying echoes of old stories and unspoken warnings. Eli tightened his coat around him, aware that the quiet of the ranch was deceptive, that nothing here would be easy, and that every step forward would demand courage, patience, and heart. And deep down he knew the first night was only the beginning. Something had stirred in the shadows of the stable, and the dawn would bring questions that could not be ignored. Eli stayed outside long after the girl had settled in the loft. The ranch was silent, but the quiet had weight, as if the land itself was watching, waiting for something to happen. He ran a hand over the worn fence post, tracing the grooves made by years of wind and neglect. The moonlight revealed the long shadows of the barn, stretching like fingers across the dusty ground. His mind raced, though he tried to keep it steady. Questions crowded every corner of his thoughts. Why had she come here, to this empty, nearly forgotten place? Who was she running from, and what danger followed her? Inside, the girl sat on the edge of the wooden crate, knees drawn close to her chest. Her name was Lyra, though she hadn't said it aloud. The moment felt too fragile for names, for introductions. She had been wandering for days, surviving on scraps and sheer will, until she stumbled onto the ranch. The old barn had seemed like a sanctuary, even though it was falling apart. She felt the wind shift around her, smelled the dry earth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a fleeting sense of hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. She had learned to trust carefully, to measure each word in action. One mistake could ruin everything. Eli returned inside quietly, carrying a small lantern. Its flickering light cast shadows across Lyra's face, highlighting the sharp lines of her cheekbones and the tension in her jaw. He placed it on the crate beside her, the soft glow pushing back some of the darkness around them. Neither spoke at first, the silence thick but not uncomfortable. It was a silence that held possibility, a pause before the next storm of questions, truths, and confessions. "I can fix this place," Eli said finally, his voice low but steady. "The barn, the fences, the house. Give me a few weeks. You'll have a safe place." His words were simple, but they carried conviction, the kind built by years of facing hardship and refusing to back down. Lyra studied him carefully. There was honesty in his eyes, a quiet strength that felt almost alien to her. She wanted to believe him, but she had been betrayed too many times to take anyone at their word. "What do you want in return?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question wasn't cruel, but it was wary. She had learned early that nothing came free, that people always expected something in exchange. "I don't want anything," he said, shaking his head. "I've had a life full of things I couldn't have. I don't need more. Just stay safe. That's enough for me." Her eyes flicked to the lantern, then to the beams overhead as though she were weighing his words against the shadows. "You don't know what I'm running from," she said after a pause. Eli nodded. "I don't, but I know what it's like to carry a weight no one else can see. I've spent years empty-handed, hoping for something that never came. Maybe we can help each other." Lyra considered that, the words settling in a small space between them. She didn't answer, and that was enough for now. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, and some fears needed time to breathe before they could be named. The night stretched on, and Eli left her to rest in the loft. He walked the perimeter of the ranch, inspecting fences and gates by lantern light. The land had potential, but it would take hard work weeks, maybe months, to make it livable. And now, with Lyra there, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protection, about something far more fragile than crops or livestock. As he moved through the barn, he noticed small signs that something had been left behind. Footprints in the dirt, faint smudges on the wooden planks, a few torn pieces of cloth caught in the hay. The signs weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Someone else had been here recently, and that knowledge made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Danger wasn't just a rumor. It could be here, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment to strike. Morning came slowly over the plains, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose. Lyra awoke to the sound of birds, the smell of sun-warmed earth, and the soft creak of the barn door opening. Eli was already outside, examining a broken fence line near the northern pasture. The wind carried a chill, sharp against the warmth of the sun, and she wrapped her arms around herself. For the first time in days, she felt the stirrings of trust. Eli noticed her and nodded, a simple gesture, but one that carried reassurance. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded, and he fetched some simple food bread, dried meat, and water from a nearby trough. They ate in silence at first, the quiet broken only by the occasional clink of utensils or the distant cry of a hawk. As they ate, Eli spoke of the land, of his plans to rebuild the ranch, to plant crops, and bring animals back to the pastures. There was pride in his voice, not arrogance, but a steady confidence born from years of knowing hard work and patience. Lyra listened, absorbing every detail. She had learned to watch people, to read their intentions, and Eli's dedication was clear. There was no pretense, no false bravado, just a man trying to make something out of the emptiness around him. Still, questions lingered. Lyra couldn't forget the fear that had driven her here, and she couldn't ignore the possibility that it might follow her. Eli's kindness was real, but the world outside the ranch was not forgiving. She had learned that danger could take many forms, men with cruel intentions, people looking to exploit weakness, and even the land itself with its hidden pitfalls and sudden storms. The ranch might be a sanctuary, but it was also isolated, a place where danger could arrive unseen. Eli noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched at sudden movements. He didn't push her to speak, but he kept a careful watch, understanding that some wounds were deeper than the eye could see. He had his own ghosts to contend with, the years of longing, the emptiness of a life without family, but he had learned patience. And patience, he knew, might be the only way to reach her trust. By mid-afternoon, Eli had begun repairing the broken fence, hammering nails into old wood and securing loose boards. The sound of his work echoed across the plains, a rhythm of persistence against the quiet of neglect. Lyra watched from the loft, the sunlight illuminating her pale skin and the tension in her eyes. Wanted to move closer to help, but something held her back, a mixture of fear, pride, and the memory of betrayal. The day passed, and evening approached with its familiar hush. Eli had finished what he could before nightfall and returned to the barn, brushing sweat from his brow. He found Lyra sitting near the lantern, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. For a long moment, they simply watched the land. The silence stretched between them, a delicate thread connecting to lives that had wandered far from safety. Then, a sound of faint rustling from the edge of the property made Eli freeze. The wind carried it from the trees near the western pasture, and though it could have been an animal, his instincts warned him otherwise. Lyra stiffened, clutching the edges of the crate. Both knew that the quiet of the ranch was deceptive. Danger could approach unnoticed, and the past could arrive in a heartbeat. Eli moved toward the door, keeping low, his hand resting on the wooden frame as he listened. The sound had stopped. Stillness returned, but the unease remained. He turned back to Lyra, who met his gaze with wide, wary eyes. Words were unnecessary. Both understood that the ranch was more than just land to be tamed. It was a place where secrets, fears, and past shadows would soon collide with the fragile life they now shared. As night settled once again, the stars above seemed brighter, more watchful than before. Eli checked the doors and windows, making sure the barn was secure. Lyra finally allowed herself to lie down on the crate, pulling the blankets close. Her mind, however, would not rest. She remembered the men who had chased her, the reason she had fled, and the uncertainty that had led her to this remote ranch. Questions swirled like dust in the wind. Could she trust Eli? Could she survive the coming days? And what would happen if her pursuers found her here? Eli sat outside for a while, listening to the night, thinking of the land and the unexpected burden of responsibility that had fallen on him. He had wanted solitude, but life had delivered something far more complicated, far more vital, a life to protect, a girl in need, perhaps unknowingly, a chance to heal a wound he hadn't known could be mended. In the shadows, the wind whispered through the broken fence posts, and Eli felt it like a warning. The ranch, for all its promise, was not yet tamed. Something waited in the darkness, something patient and unforgiving, ready to test the fragile peace that had just begun. And somewhere deep in the barn, Lyra whispered her own prayer, hoping that the man who had given her refuge could withstand what was coming. The morning brought a sharp chill, the kind that made the prairie seem endless and unforgiving. Eli rose before dawn, the lantern from the night before casting a weak glow in the loft. Lyra was still asleep, curled beneath the thin blankets, and for a moment he studied her, noting the tension in her jaw even as her face softened in sleep. He knew that danger wasn't just outside the barn. It followed her, a shadow he could not yet name. Every step he took on the rough wooden floor was careful, measured as though any careless movement might stir more than the sleeping girl. Outside, the ranch stretched wide, a mixture of wild grass, broken fences, and skeletal trees. Eli walked to the northern pasture, inspecting the line where the fence had given way during the last storm. Nails were loose, wood splintered, but it could be fixed. He worked methodically, hammering each post, resetting the rails, while the sun edged higher, warming the chill in the air. The work demanded focus, yet even as he labored, his mind kept returning to Lyra and the unspoken story she carried. There were pieces missing, pieces she hadn't shared, and Eli could feel the weight of them pressing silently between them. Lyra eventually woke, and the first thing she noticed was Eli in the field. Moving with the precision of a man who had built his life on routine and survival, she stepped outside, the soft thud of her boots on dry earth punctuating the quiet morning. "You don't sleep much," she said, her voice still carrying the remnants of caution. Eli glanced up, offering a half-smile. "Sleep comes when it's safe. Prefer to work when the day's young." He gestured to the fence. "Gotta make sure nothing comes crawling in that shouldn't." She nodded, watching him closely. The ranch, she realized, was a reflection of Eli himself. Rough, weathered, and scarred, but with potential to grow strong again. There was a quiet dignity in how he moved, an unspoken promise that he could withstand more than most. And yet she couldn't ignore the unease prickling at the edges of her mind. Someone, or something, had followed her this far. The thought made her chest tighten, and she shifted her gaze toward the distant tree line, where shadows seemed too deep, too deliberate. The first signs of trouble came by noon. A rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the heat haze, moving faster than any casual traveler. Eli saw it first, squinting into the distance. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a tension that had nothing to do with labor or the wind. The figure slowed at the crest of a hill, studying the ranch as though trying to measure its value or its weakness. Lyra instinctively ducked behind the barn. "They found me," she whispered. The words were barely audible, but Eli caught them, and his jaw tightened. He had anticipated this, feared it even, but to see it manifest so suddenly left him with a surge of urgency he couldn't ignore. Eli approached calmly, but deliberately, placing himself between Lyra and the rider. "Stay back," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced more than he wanted to remember. The rider reined in his horse, the animal snorting, and for a moment there was silence, stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. "You, Carver?" the rider demanded, voice rough, edged with suspicion. "I am," Eli said evenly, stepping forward. "This is private property." The rider's eyes flicked toward the barn, and a shadow crossed his face. He hesitated, then spoke. "There's someone in there. A girl. Pregnant. You know her?" Eli's grip on the lantern tightened, though he kept his expression neutral. "I don't ask questions. I don't need to. She's safe here, and that's all that matters." The man's brow furrowed, and he glanced toward the horizon, as if calculating something unseen. "You should be careful. Some things don't belong in places like this. Trouble has a way of finding the unprepared." He turned his horse sharply and vanished back over the ridge, leaving Eli and Lyra standing in a tense, lingering quiet. Lyra exhaled shakily, her back pressed to the barn's wall. "You think he'll come back?" she asked. Eli shook his head slowly, but his eyes remained on the ridge. "Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter. We can't wait for trouble to decide." His voice was calm, but inside a storm of calculations and warnings swirled. Whoever that man was, and whatever he represented, it was clear Lyra's past had caught up with her. And now, the ranch's refuge, his solitary claim to purpose, had become part of the battlefield. Over the next few days, Eli worked tirelessly, repairing fences, clearing brush, and reinforcing the barn. Lyra helped where she could, though she remained cautious. Every glance toward the tree line a reminder of the uncertainty that loomed. As they labored, fragments of conversation began to surface. Small admissions that hinted at the girl's past, but never fully revealed it. She had fled a town too small to hide her secrets, and people who would pursue her for reasons she wouldn't yet name. At night, the ranch seemed to pulse with unspoken threats. Shadows moved differently. The wind carried hints of voices that weren't there. And both Eli and Lyra felt the weight of eyes watching from beyond the tree line. The animals Eli had begun to bring in horses. A few goats were skittish, sensing the tension in ways humans often overlooked. Every creak, every snap of a twig, became a question they both answered silently. Friend or foe? Row, safe or danger? One evening, as the sun dipped behind the western hills, Lyra finally spoke more of her journey. She told Eli about the small town where she had lived, the people who had forced her to flee, and the narrow escapes that had carried her to the ranch. Each word was measured, cautious, revealing enough to build a picture, but never enough to lay the full truth bare. Eli listened, absorbing the fragments, trying to map the danger she had left behind onto the land he now claimed. "You're not alone here," he said softly when she paused. "I've faced emptiness, loss, and disappointment, and I'm still standing. You won't have to face what's coming by yourself." Lyra studied him, the firelight flickering across her face. "And if it's too much, if what follows me finds us?" Eli's eyes hardened with resolve. "Then we fight it, together." But the truth was harsher than his words. The ranch was isolated, the nearest town a day's ride away, and reinforcements were non-existent. Whoever was pursuing Lyra could be patient, calculated, relentless. And while Eli had strength and knowledge of the land, he had never faced this kind of threat before. The stakes were higher than fences or crops. They were about life, survival, and trust. As nights grew longer, subtle signs appeared that trouble might not just be external. Footprints in the dirt, marks on the barn doors, small items moved or missing. These were things Eli noticed but couldn't yet explain. Lyra grew more tense, a constant vigilance shadowing her features, and even Eli felt the prickle of fear at times. The ranch, once a sanctuary of silence, had become a place of watchfulness, where every sound mattered and every shadow could hide intent. Tensions between them also grew, though not in anger, but in understanding the burden each carried. Eli struggled with the fear of failing her, with the awareness that he was more than just caretaker. He was protector, strategist, and perhaps the only chance Lyra had at safety. Lyra, on the other hand, wrestled with the pull of independence, the instinct to flee, and the need to trust a man she barely knew. Each day brought small tests, small compromises, and small victories that hinted at a fragile bond forming amidst the tension. Then, One evening, a distant scream echoed across the plains, a sharp, ragged sound that carried far and lingered in the air. Both Eli and Lyra froze, the hairs on their necks standing on end. It was a reminder that danger was not just a memory or a rumor. It existed, and it moved in ways neither of them could yet predict. Eli tightened his grip on a hammer, his eyes scanning the horizon. Lyra pressed herself to the barn wall, silent, tense, aware that the life she had fled and the choices she had made were converging here, in this lonely stretch of land. As the moon rose that night, silver light spilling over the ranch, both of them knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same. The land promised solitude, growth, and opportunity, but it also demanded vigilance, courage, and trust. And while Eli had built walls and secured fences, neither of them could build walls around the unknown, the shadows that waited beyond the tree line, the past that refused to release its grip, and the future that demanded they face it together. The wind carried a low whistle across the plains, echoing in the empty spaces of the barn, and both Eli and Lyra listened. Somewhere out there, a presence lingered, patient and deliberate, a reminder that the real battle had only just begun. The night was heavy, pressing down on the ranch like a living thing. The wind moved through the broken fences and skeletal trees with a mournful hiss, carrying scents of distant fires and dry earth. Eli Carver sat in the loft beside Lyra, the lantern's flame trembling between them. Every sound seemed amplified: the creak of the barn door, the flutter of a bat's wings, even the low groan of the earth, as if it remembered old secrets. Both of them were awake, hearts hammering, minds straining for threats they could not yet see. Lyra's eyes flicked toward the shadows. "They're close," she whispered, almost to herself. Eli didn't reply immediately, simply listened, straining to catch any sound that didn't belong to the natural night. He had felt the threat building for days, subtle at first, then growing into something that gnawed at the edges of their sanctuary. Whoever had chased Lyra to the ranch wasn't a man to be dismissed. Patience, persistence, and perhaps even ruthlessness had brought them this far. He rose quietly, moving to the barn door to peer into the darkness. The horizon was empty, save for the silhouettes of distant hills. Yet the stillness felt wrong, almost unnatural. Something stirred among the shadows near the western tree line, a shape too deliberate to be the work of animals. Eli's hand went to the handle of his rifle, a weight that felt heavier than usual. He felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the pulse at his temples. Every instinct screamed that they were being watched. Lyra followed silently, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "You think he'll come tonight?" she asked, voice low. Eli's gaze did not leave the darkness. "I don't know. But we have to be ready," he said. His voice carried a quiet authority, the kind earned through years of survival and solitude. He did not want her to panic, yet he could not lie. Danger was real, and it was patient. The hours stretched, the moon riding high and casting silver light across the prairie. Then, a sudden sound, a branch snapping, too deliberate, too close, shattered the silence. Eli's heart surged as he grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her back toward the loft's corner. Shadows shifted outside, and the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding against dry earth carried through the night. Someone was approaching fast, careful but deliberate. Eli's mind raced. They had come for her, and by extension, they would challenge the sanctuary he had worked so hard to create. From the loft, Lyra peeked down, spotting figures moving with intent through the fence line Eli had recently repaired. There were two of them, mounted and armed, faces obscured by scarves. They weren't local townsfolk. She could tell by the way they surveyed the land, assessing weaknesses, testing boundaries. She shivered, the memory of past betrayals pressing down on her. Eli saw the fear, the tension coiling around her, and he felt a familiar ache, responsibility heavier than any he had borne before. "Stay here," he whispered, moving to the door. His boots sank slightly into the dirt outside as he approached the intruders, rifle at the ready. The figures froze at the edge of the barn, as though sensing the weight of his presence. Eli's voice cut through the night, steady and commanding. "This land is mine. Turn back." One of them laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the plains. "Carver, we're not here for land," he said. "We're here for her." Eli's pulse quickened. So much was at stake. He had known the threat wasn't idle, but hearing it voiced so clearly made the danger tangible, imminent. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to move, to run, but Eli's presence anchored her. He was more than a protector. He was a shield. And yet the sheer proximity of danger reminded her that nothing was guaranteed, not even in this isolated stretch of land. The first confrontation was subtle. Words were exchanged, threats veiled beneath polite tones, yet tension coiled tightly in every pause. Eli measured their movements, noting the way the men's hands hovered near weapons. He calculated options, escape routes, and the terrain. Every decision mattered. Every second could be the difference between survival and disaster. Suddenly one of the men dismounted, stepping toward the barn with slow, deliberate movements. Eli adjusted his stance, rifle ready, body tense. Lyra's heart pounded, and she instinctively backed toward the loft, praying silently that their isolated refuge would hold against the approaching storm. "You don't know what you've stumbled into," the man said, voice low, carrying the edge of menace. "She belongs elsewhere. Leave now, and no one gets hurt." Eli's eyes narrowed. He had never faced a threat like this in his lifetime, and yet a familiar determination surged. This ranch, this girl, the fragile promise of safety, they would not be taken lightly. The night stretched, broken only by the distant cry of a coyote and the shifting of the intruder's shadows. Eli and the men circled, each aware of the delicate balance between caution and aggression. Lyra watched from above, the weight of her own fears pressing against her chest. She had survived alone for too long, and yet the presence of Eli had introduced a new dynamic. A fragile trust she wasn't ready to fully acknowledge but needed desperately. Hours passed like this, tension mounting, each movement heavy with unspoken consequences. Ali could feel the pressure of history, of the empty lands he had purchased for $1. Transformed into a battlefield for survival, hope, and protection. The men's intentions remained veiled, and Eli could sense the patience behind every careful step. They were testing him, probing for weakness. By the time the moon dipped low, painting the ranch in a cold silver light, the standoff had reached its peak. The men retreated to the edge of the property for a moment, whispering to each other, and Eli realized this was not a simple confrontation. It was strategic, deliberate, a test of endurance. They wanted to see how far he would go, how much he would protect. Lyra, despite fear, began to understand the depth of Eli's commitment. She saw how he moved, how his eyes never wavered, how every step, every calculation, was about ensuring her safety. Something in her chest shifted a small spark of trust, fragile but undeniable. She realized that the ranch, the dollar he had spent, the solitude he had embraced, they were no longer just elements of his life. They were foundations for something far greater: protection, resilience, and perhaps even redemption. The night deepened, shadows twisting across the prairie, and both Eli and Lyra sensed the tension reaching its apex. Every creak of the barn, every rustle of the trees, every distant sound seemed amplified. They were poised on the edge of chaos, aware that the next move could tip the balance toward destruction or survival. As dawn began to break, painting the horizon in streaks of pale gold and rose, Eli stood at the edge of the barn, rifle in hand, scanning the distant tree line. Lyra emerged from the loft, her expression steeled with a mix of fear and determination. They exchanged a brief glance, the unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. The coming day would demand everything they had: strength, courage, and trust. And somewhere beyond the tree line, hidden by shadows, eyes watched, waiting for the moment to strike. The ranch, once a place of hope, was now a crucible, testing them both in ways neither had anticipated. Each heartbeat, each breath, carried the weight of possibility and danger. The land beneath their feet, the barn that had become a fragile fortress, and the sky above were witnesses to the quiet tension, the anticipation of confrontation, and the fragile spark of life and trust that had blossomed amidst the fear. The horizon shimmered with the first light of day, but the air was thick with uncertainty. Every shadow could conceal an ally or an enemy. Every sound could signal the start of a storm. Eli's grip on his rifle tightened, and Lyra's hand brushed his, a gesture as much about courage as it was about solidarity. They were on the edge, the moment before the world shifted. And both understood that what came next would define not only their survival, but the fragile hope they had begun to build. And as the first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the broken fences, both of them knew the climax was approaching, the point where courage, trust, and determination would collide with danger, and where the outcome, though uncertain, would shape the future of the ranch and their lives forever. The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting the prairie in soft golds and pinks. Eli Carver stood at the edge of the barn, eyes scanning the land, but there was no movement in the tree line. The night had stretched long and tense, and while shadows still lingered in the corners of the ranch, the immediate threat seemed to have passed. He lowered his rifle slowly, muscles still coiled from the hours of vigilance. Every fiber of him remained alert, but relief settled like a fragile layer over the constant tension. Lyra stepped beside him, the morning light revealing the weariness etched into her face. She had spent the night in quiet fear, but now the sharp edge of panic had dulled, replaced by a cautious optimism. She looked at Eli, the man who had offered her sanctuary without question, who had stood between her and unknown danger. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. "They're gone," she whispered. Eli nodded, though he didn't take his eyes off the horizon. "Now. But they'll remember this place, and they'll think twice before returning." His voice carried the calm of a man who had faced loss, disappointment, and danger, yet refused to bend beneath it. He turned to Lyra and offered a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe here. As long as we watch together, this land belongs to us." The days that followed were a mixture of labor and quiet rebuilding. Eli focused on restoring the ranch to a place that could provide both shelter and security. Broken fences were mended, the barn reinforced, and he even began planting hardy crops, the first signs of life taking root in the dry soil. Lyra assisted where she could, her hands growing calloused, her movements careful but strong. Together, they transformed the neglected property into a functioning homestead, each task a small victory against the shadow of fear that had followed them. During these hours of shared work, trust between them deepened. Lyra began to speak of herself in more detail, though she never revealed every secret. She told Eli about the town she had fled, the people who had pursued her, and the moments that had driven her to desperation. He listened without judgment, offering advice only when asked, teaching her to use the land's features for security, and showing her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Eli, in turn, allowed fragments of his own story to surface. He spoke of the years of longing for family, of the ache in his life that had seemed permanent, and of the dollar he had spent to claim this ranch, believing it might be his last chance to leave something lasting behind. Lyra listened, surprised by the depth of his resilience and the gentle strength beneath his rugged exterior. They discovered in each other a kind of companionship neither had expected, a partnership forged through shared struggle and quiet understanding. One afternoon, a distant rider appeared on the horizon, not in threat but in curiosity. It was a neighboring rancher, someone who had heard rumors about the man who had bought the abandoned land for $1 and about the girl who had taken refuge there. He approached cautiously, tipping his hat in greeting. "Heard you've got things running here," he said. "Figured I'd come see for myself." Eli's posture relaxed slightly, but his gaze remained steady. "The land's recovering. It'll be stronger than it's ever been," he said. The neighbor nodded, impressed by the transformation from decay to vitality. It was a subtle moment, yet it marked the first acknowledgement that the ranch once thought cursed was now a place of hope and potential. Lyra watched the interaction, feeling a surge of pride and relief. The land that had once felt like a trap, a final stop before despair, was now a sanctuary. She had a part in shaping it. The sense of being hunted, the constant vigilance, had begun to fade, replaced by something far more enduring. The knowledge that she belonged, that she had allies, and that she could face the future without fear. The most profound change, however, was in the barn loft. Eli had prepared a comfortable space for her, and small touches of care had made it feel like home. Blankets were clean and warm, food was plentiful, and the barn itself had become a fortress. Nights no longer brought panic, but a quiet vigil, where both Eli and Lyra would sit together and watch the stars, sharing moments of silence that spoke more than words ever could. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the ranch in amber light, Eli and Lyra walked the fence line together. They moved with the rhythm of people who had built something together, each step a testament to patience, resilience, and quiet determination. Lyra rested her hand on Eli's arm, feeling the steadiness that had become a lifeline in her life. "I can't believe how far we've come," she said softly. Eli glanced at her, a small smile breaking through his weathered face. "Neither can I, but the land has a way of teaching patience. Sometimes the people who find it can learn too." He paused, looking across the prairie, where the morning's tension had faded into a tapestry of gold and green. "This place, it's ours now." Even the animals seemed to sense the change. The horses grazed peacefully, the goats wandered among the newly cleared pasture, and the faint hum of life returned to the ranch. The once empty spaces now held promise. Each sound and movement a reminder that survival was not just about endurance, but about nurturing, building, and embracing hope. The final confrontation with the shadows that had haunted Lyra never came. The men who had pursued her either gave up or were distracted by other pursuits, leaving the ranch in peace. Eli and Lyra had prepared for conflict, yet the resolution came not through confrontation, but through steadfast presence, patience, and the careful assertion of a home reclaimed. Their vigilance had been enough to deter the threat, and the land itself seemed to stand with them, offering a quiet strength that reinforced the bonds between them. As the weeks passed, life settled into a rhythm. Lyra's belly began to show signs of new life, a symbol of hope and continuity that contrasted sharply with the fear she had carried. Eli worked alongside her, building, teaching, and protecting, each day reinforcing the sanctuary they had created together. The ranch, once a barren stretch of forgotten land, had become a place of promise, safety, and even joy. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch overlooking the fields, Eli took Lyra's hand, feeling the warmth and life within her grasp. "You brought this here," he said. "Not just yourself, but everything you carry with you. And together, we've built something stronger than either of us imagined." Lyra smiled, a mix of relief, pride, and the quiet happiness that comes from finally feeling at home. "We did it together," she replied. In the evenings, they would sit beneath the stars, speaking of dreams, plans, and the life they hoped to build. The ranch was no longer just a piece of land purchased for $1. It had become a testament to resilience, trust, and the quiet power of human connection. Every fence repaired, every crop planted, every moment of shared courage was a reminder that, even in the face of fear and uncertainty, hope could take root and flourish. The story of the ranch, of Eli and Lyra, became a quiet legend in the surrounding towns. Neighbors spoke of the man who had bought $1 property and the girl who had appeared in his barn, and how together they had turned fear into safety, despair into promise. But beyond the tales, beyond the whispers, the real triumph was private. It lived in the moments of care, work, and shared resilience. One morning, as the sun rose over the rolling hills, Lyra felt the first strong kicks of the life she carried within her. Eli sat beside her, hands on her shoulders, feeling the movement, feeling the future pressing softly against the present. There was no fanfare, no announcement, only the quiet, undeniable truth. Life had arrived. Fragile, yet persistent, a reward for patience, courage, and steadfastness. Eli looked over the ranch, the fields stretching beyond the horizon, the barns standing strong, and the animals moving freely across the pasture. He breathed in the crisp morning air and felt something he hadn't in years: completeness. He had wanted purpose, a chance to leave something behind, and now he had more than that. He had life, hope, and trust. And beside him, Lyra carried the most extraordinary promise of all. They worked together until the sun dipped low, and as night fell, the ranch settled into a quiet peace it had not known in decades. Shadows no longer held fear. They were part of the landscape, tamed by care, vigilance, and resilience. Eli and Lyra sat in the loft, watching the stars, hearts lighter than they had been in years. The dollar ranch had become a home, and a life had been protected and nurtured within it. The land, the girl, and the man who had once thought himself powerless had all changed. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and the threat of outside danger. Yet through patience, courage, and trust, they had created something enduring. And though the future remained unwritten, there was a quiet certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Eli took Lyra's hand one last time before sleep, feeling the warmth and the heartbeat of the life they had begun to protect. "We're ready," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Lyra smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Yes," she said softly, "we're ready." And in that moment, beneath the stars, with the barn standing strong and the prairie stretching endless around them, the ranch belonged to them, fully and completely, a testament to hope, perseverance, and the quiet power of human connection. The wind moved through the fields, carrying with it the faint scent of wildflowers and new life. And for the first time in years, both Eli Carver and Lyra felt the world was wide enough to hold all the possibilities they had dreamed of, together in the place they now called home.